afternoon. So today I want to address unionism in the run-up to Home Rule, really to fit in with what we have done in the previous video, which was looking at the Home Rule movement. Unionism emerged as a powerful force in both Irish and British politics, really in direct response to Parnellism, and it became a significant force around 1885, and of course that developed and started to change rapidly in the first decade of the 20th century. There were three different unionist groupings, and initially the distinctions between those unionist groupings wouldn't have been as clear cut as they became over the period of time that we're interested in, and particularly during the Third Home Rule Bill or the Home Rule crisis. They were different, but they all had the same overall purpose of maintaining the active union and defeating Home Rule. I mean, that one overall overarching aim really was significant for all three groups. They were geographically distinct groups, and really the way that we break them up is really to think about that. So there were Southern Unionists who were connected to the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, and many of them would have been members of that Anglo-Irish ascendancy, the sort of landlord class. They were concentrated in the three southern provinces, but scattered geographically throughout that, so there wasn't one location where you have a real significant concentration of Southern Unionists. They were drawn from a narrow social base of mainly landowners or business professional middle classes. And I mean, their connections, I think, with British conservatives in particular through landlordism were very significant. Ulster Unionists had a strong regional identity and were very connected to the sort of Ulster Protestant traditions and through organisations such as the Orange Order. They were concentrated in the northeast, particularly in the plantation counties of Antrim, Down, Londonderry and Armagh. And the members were drawn from a wide social base, which was very different and would become more significant as the Home Rule crisis developed. British Unionists were based at Westminster, were drawn from both the Conservative and Liberal party. So initially, I think there's a tendency to think that the only British Unionists are Conservatives, but that's not the case. And that does become apparent throughout the Home Rule issue. Liberals do become more associated with Home Rule as they're the party that introduced it, but there are certainly Liberal Unionists there too. Initially, Irish Unionism was very much part of British Unionism and operated within the parliamentary movement at Westminster. But the gap developed between these forms of unionism as the Home Rule issue took feet and as things developed. The 1884 Reform Act, which extended the Irish franchise, and the 1885 Redistribution Act, which redistributed Irish seats at Westminster, created a radical shift in Irish politics. In the 1885 election, for example, in Ulster, Home Rulers increased their seats from 3 to 17, which gave them the majority of the province of Ulster's 33 seats. And later on, that becomes significant in terms of when we're assessing how Redmond, or indeed Asquith, handled the Home Rule issue. I mean, this is one of the factors they would have been considering when looking at Unionist opposition to Home Rule. And part of the reason, certainly, why they were initially very dismissive of that opposition. There was an increase in religious polarisation at the sort of around the late 19th, early 20th century as well. Certainly, membership of the Orange Order revived around that time. And by January of 1886, there was an identifiable unionist group gathering around Edward Saunderson, who was the MP for Armagh. Although they were still under the wing of the Conservative Party, they began to act in unison to thwart the Home Rule campaign. And some Conservatives, like Lord Randolph Churchill, were very prepared to go for populist measures like the playing of the orange card for political expediency in order to, see off the Liberal Party. But there were others within unionism who were less keen on this, and particularly fears of Irish unionists, would have been that this could get out of hand, and later on we'll talk about that. As time progressed, it became more difficult to make a distinction within the British Unionists between those who were really motivated by a desire to maintain the empire and those who were actually just seeing this as an opportunity for political opportunism to try to defeat the Liberals. However, both of those factors are important for British Unionists. The origins of Irish Unionism lie in the formation in 1885 of the Irish Loyal and Patriotic Union. And even the date on that tells us that this has always been related to the emerging Home Rule movement. The group contested 52 seats, but were only successful in picking up the 2 seats associated with Trinity College, Dublin. And they quickly realised that election campaigns in the South were not really going to pay off because they represented a small elite group, really representing that old Anglo-Irish ascendancy. Unionists were always guaranteed more electoral success in the north, and the newly formed Ulster Loyalist Anti-Repeal Union got much more support, winning 17 of 33 Ulster seats in the July election, which followed the defeat of the first Home Rule Bill in 1886. Northern Unionists were given another boost after the second Home Rule Bill was defeated, and this led to a conference set up really established by the Ulster Unionists to attract people from all over Ireland, although the focus was on Ulster Unionists, and to talk about what would happen if a third Home Rule Bill was to come in. The failure of the second Home Rule Bill and Gladstone's then retirement led to a slackening of unionist activity, both within Northern and Southern Unionism. The 3 unionist factions therefore worked together to stop the 1892 bill, but already there were differences emerging between them. So what are those differences? British Unionists are concerned for the threat that Home Rule poses for the UK and the Empire. They have sympathy for the plight of Irish Unionists, but their real concern is for the UK. It's not for Ireland. And their defiance is suspiciously linked to periods when they are out of office. So, this is where the political expediency argument comes in. Southern Unionists are more tolerant of Catholicism than Ulster Unionists. The threat to religious freedom never really featured prominently in their campaign against Home Rule. They're much more fearful of financial chaos and destruction of a traditional pattern of life, which makes sense when you think that they're mostly the landlord class. They have this fear that a parliament dominated by lower class Catholics wouldn't be able to operate effectively. They specifically feared having their land confiscated, directly or indirectly by a harsh taxation system. And they wrongly claimed that there wasn't a grassroots support for Home Rule, which is inaccurate. They have a huge amount of influence at Westminster amongst the political elite, and particularly in the Lords, where many of them, because of their land that they own, have positions in the Lords. Ulster Unionism, which of course comes to be the dominant form of unionism in the period we're most interested in, have different reasons. There is a fear of religious persecution, and of course that is ramped up in the time frame that we're looking at. There was a fear of a threat to Ulster's economic prosperity, and particularly prosperity of Belfast, the seat of shipbuilding and linen production and all of these really big growth industries at that time. There was also this social contractarian argument that Ulster Unionists would use, that their ancestors had colonised Ireland on behalf of England, so they shouldn't be left at the mercy of the enemy. And that does come in quite a lot in the arguments around Third Home Rule Bill. And also references to the racial superiority of Ulster Protestants, a sort of social Darwinist argument, which of course in the context of the late 19th, early 20th century would not be unusual. They followed the IPP example and worked as a pressure group at Westminster. For the most part, they don't share the wider empire concerns of British Unionists, but they're perfectly well prepared to use those to help their cause. So the factions within unionism, party discipline was never rigidly enforced in the way that it was enforced by by Parnell with the Home Rule Party. And there were significant divisions in this period within unionism between more progressive unionists and rural unionists, like, for example, T.W. Russell, who's a particularly interesting character. And for a brief moment, the formation of a more radical, independent Orange Order posed a real threat to the Unionist Party's control of Ulster Protestants. However, the independent Orange Order ultimately failed as unionism successfully closed ranks under its renewed form in 1906. And I think after 1906, it's fair to say that the focus very quickly becomes on Ulster unionism. Okay, so Saunderson had a policy of constructive unionism. This was seen as appeasing Irish nationalists, and it would ultimately lead to his decline. The first move in the development of new unionism was the setting up of the Ulster Unionist Council, which was established in 1905. So this was the central unionist authority aimed to transform Ulster unionism into a coherent fighting group that would be able to reconnect the party with its grassroots support. Now, for that reason, there were 100 members drawn from existing MPs, the Orange Order hierarchy, and another that would be directly elected from Orange lodges and local unionist associations. So from the very beginning, it's very tied to Orangism. The council was dominated, and certainly those in any positions of power, was dominated by middle-class Protestant bourgeoisie, but that again sets it aside from unionism in the south of Ireland, which is landlord-dominated. So it certainly confirmed that in Ulster there was also a change in the class base of unionism in terms of leadership. The leadership wasn't obviously more in touch with grassroots opinion, but it did provide a good organisational framework for the struggle against Home Rule between 1912 to 14. And the formation of the UUC is definitely a break between Southern and Ulster unionism, as Ulster unionism becomes much more exclusive and radical as that time frame develops. So what are features of the Ulster Unionist Party after 1906? It's less concerned with its southern counterpart, and also sceptical about the depth of support from the Conservative Party. This uneasy relationship between Ulster Unionism and conservatism, which continues to this day in many respects, was seen from that time on. And I mean, things like the devolution proposal had really made Ulster Unionists a bit suspicious about the extent to which they could rely on the Conservatives. The party was more responsive to local and constituency concerns, and it gave a great role to the Orange Order, which made it much more militant than previous forms of unionism have been. So despite Conservative disgusted Ulster Unionists' campaign against Wyndham, and there was a feeling that the Ulster Unionists went too far. They personalised that Wyndham had brought a lot of reforms as part of killing Home Rule with kindness, that there was a bigger project, that Ulster Unionists weren't getting the picture, that the idea was that these reforms would be a more effective way of getting rid of Home Rule. They still went some way to appease Ulster Unionists by appointing Walter Long as the new Irish Chief Secretary. Long had estates in County Wicklow. He had a deeply held contempt for Catholic Irish. He relied heavily on Saunderson's advice in order to become well acquainted with the Ulster Unionist cause. And this drew Ulster Unionists and the British Conservative Party closer together at that time. However, the tariff reform issue came along. The Conservative Party, which was already struggling somewhat at that time, is really devastated by that issue. And the Conservative Party splits into two factions, the protectionists and the free traders. And it's this split that sets the background for the Liberal landslide victory in 1906. And of course, it's this split as well that makes it important for Conservatives wanting to return to power to be able to find some way of uniting the party and avoiding the tricky issue of protectionism versus laissez-faire policies. So Edward Saunderson died in October of 1906, and Walter Long then replaced him as leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. Now, Long had been the chief spokesman for British Unionism for quite some time, and he had made an effort to cement Irish Unionism and British conservatism at that time. He established a joint committee of unionist associations to try to develop closer relations between Southern and Ulster Unionism, but cooperation was limited on that issue. Long also formed the Union Defence League, which included a number of senior Conservatives in response to the Irish Council Bill. However, the subsequent withdrawal of Barrell's bill removed the necessary stimulus which might have galvanised this new organisation. After this start, Long was sidelined by illness for much of 1908, by which time Asquith had succeeded Campbell Bannerman as Liberal leader, and the ensuing constitutional crisis was poised up the ante with regards to Liberal and Conservative rivalry and the Home Rule issue. So really the focus then between 1909, as we mentioned in the previous video about the Home Rule movement, was really on the constitutional issue and the battle between the Commons and the Lords, ultimately the battle between reforming Liberals and old style traditional Conservatives. But that is what the focus is after that point. So it's a quick overview of unionism. There's some really interesting sidelines that we haven't gone down. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said about the factions within unionism. There's the early spores of within unionism of the more working class unionist representatives who are looking to develop class-based unionism, and that quickly becomes submerged, and most of them end up breaking away. Some end up going to the United Irish League and ending up somehow with the Home Rule Party. You know, there's lots of little interesting deviations here, but just to get an idea of what was happening within unionism in the same time frame, in that run up to 1910, 1911. Hopefully this helps to give you a good overview of that.